Right, Matrix, we are now going to pick up where we left off from our previous video, looking at the different bodies of evidence that are used to support evolution. And we're going to start looking at the second piece of information, which is our modification by descent. It's also known as comparative anatomy. And effectively, this is a really important piece of information and a body of evidence that we use that allows us to look at the similarities and the differences in anatomy of different organisms, and how more similarities can make us lean towards there being closer in evolutionary time. Perhaps they share more common ancestors with one another, and then fewer similarities then can lead us to show that they perhaps had less common ancestors and perhaps followed different evolutionary pathways. And a particular group of structures that we use to describe modification with descent is structures called homologous structures. And these are structures that look like each other, and they come from the same ancestral lineage. In other words, it is a structure that has the same common ancestor and that it has descended but modified over time. And a perfect example is, like we have in the picture here, the change and the modification of the bones found in the forelimb. And so we have a human, a horse, cat, bat, bird, and whale, and in each one of these pictures we have the forelimb pictured. So we have the humerus, the ulna, the radius, the carpals, metacarpals, and the phalanges, and they have, if you can look very carefully, the bones that are shared amongst each of these organisms is colored in the same color. So for example, a very obvious one that we can see here is in humans and in horses and cats is the humerus. This bone over here you can see in all of them, including the bat actually as well, in the bird and in the whale. The humerus bone is present in each one of them. You'll notice, however, though, that the shape, the size has changed, and even the thickness has changed, and that's an example of modification. The origin of this bone would mean that our ancestor, our mammalian ancestor, would have had a humerus bone. However, the humerus has evolved and modified depending on that organism's way of life. A great, very contrasting example would be to look at the human's humerus and see its shape, to look at its overall width and its location in the arm. And if you compare that to the whale, on the other hand, the whale's humerus is much smaller, it's reduced in size, but it's still present. And that shows that they have a common ancestor, but perhaps the difference and the time change in between the origins of their species might be quite great, and there might have been a lot of environmental changes that would have occurred. And you can look at the same in any of the other bones, in any of these mammal examples, even something like the phalanges in the bat, which are effectively their finger bones, which take up most of their wing space. Compare that to perhaps of a horse, where a horse actually just has one phalange. It's the modified phalange. That means they walk on their toes, actually. They walk on their fingertips and they tiptoe around. All of these are pieces of evidence to show a common ancestor that has modified via descent. Now let's look at our next piece of evidence, and that is our biogeography. And the name sort of gives it away. It's obviously a combination between biology and geography, and this is a really important one because geography ultimately dictates the environment. It dictates the climate, so the temperature, the rainfall, the amount of photo hours, in other words, the length of time that the sun is up for. And if we have one thought that guides us through this entire topic of evolution, and that is the environment is what dictates the evolutionary pathway of an organism, then geography and biology often overlap with one another when explaining evolution. And biogeography leads us to the conclusion that organisms look different because of the environmental circumstances they find them in. So they look the way they do because of where we find them. And species that are generally closer together in distance often look and are more closely related. And that, to an extent, makes sense if you think of birds that live in particular regions on the earth. They might not look identical, but they have a lot of similarities between them, and that all has to do with the environment around them. Something perhaps easy to think of so that you can visualize that would be, think of birds that perhaps live in desert environments. They might be different sizes, but they collectively have a lot of similarities to allow them to live in the desert. So perhaps it might be the color of their feathers for camouflage and for safety. It might be the structure of their feathers that allows them to cool off better. Perhaps it might even be the way in which they store water, how their kidneys function. And so even though they might not look identical, their environment has dictated a certain, let's call it successful phenotype, and they then all exhibit examples of what might be a successful phenotype. If, however, we were to compare them to other organisms in the same conditions elsewhere, they should have similar characteristics. However, there would still be greater differences between them. In other words, birds found in a desert have lots of qualities that are shared between them because they are occupying the same niche. If I were to go to another desert somewhere else in the world, those birds look and behave the way they do because they suit their niche. Now, they're both desert birds, but if this was birds from the American continent and I was comparing them to birds on the Asian continent, they would be less related to one another, and simply because of the geography that separates them. Are they both birds? Yes, so they share a common ancestor. Do they have the ability to live in dry, arid conditions? Yes, they share that common ancestor. But perhaps more closer or more recently in their evolution, because of their geographical separation, they might have differences within them that you won't find in their local population. In other words, American desert birds are less related to Asian desert birds. The picture on the board at the moment is of some Darwin finches, and these birds are a beautiful example of biogeography that occurred where finches that were found on the mainland of South America ended up on some islands off the coast of South America, and their beak changed, their feathers changed, their color changed, and that was all due to their geographical location. And so that's the third piece of evidence that we have for evolution, is how the geography of their location allows us to see how they have changed and how they have evolved. And to continue with the Darwin's finches example is, if we started looking at the first, let's call it the original finch that would have come from the mainland, they specifically ate seeds, and their beaks were quite large, they were quite a dark color, and they're actually quite large, kind of plump birds from the mainland. When the finches were blown onto, the theory is that they were blown onto nearby islands via a storm, they then created little pockets of diversity. And those little pockets of diversity were based on effectively what they could find in their environment, so their geography. And so that's why we ended up having finches who could eat leaves and feed off of insects, finches that perhaps ate more fruit or buds, flower buds, or perhaps grubs, and you can see how their beaks have changed. Why did their beaks change? Because their geography changed, their niche changed, their physical environment changed, and they either had to evolve or die. Now, when I say they had to, I don't want you to think that they chose to evolve, because that's a big misconception as well, which I'm going to clear up in another video. How do organisms actually become a new species? And so if we look at this diagram here of an idea roughly of how these finches actually changed over time and how biogeography works, you need to think of it as geological separation. And so if we take our first little island here, we have species A. They are experiencing the same environment. They are experiencing the same climatic conditions, the same predators, the same diseases. There's nothing separating them from one another. And remember, as long as an organism can interbreed with itself and within its own species, the genes can be passed around in the entire population. But let's say, for example, something happens, and this is a small island, but it could even be as big as a continent. You get a piece of land separating from the other piece, and you now have some kind of geographical barrier that's in between the two pieces of land, and you end up having species A, the parent species, on one island, and you get over time species B evolving. Now, the mechanisms that would allow this to happen is the environment, and I'm going to go into a lot of detail of how this works under the formation of species in a much later on lesson, but this is just to show you how the geography and the location of a species can influence how many species arise from it. One important thing to notice if you sort of look through these diagrams is the original parental generation or the original population, which is population A, is present all the way through in these pictures here. And you'll notice that, you know, population A and B becomes population C evolves into D, and then E. And I want you to know that common ancestors don't necessarily have to become extinct. They can exist at the same time as their descendants. But very often the geological timescale that this happens is so enormous that many organisms are not necessarily around at the same time, or we haven't found them to be existing at the same time necessarily. So can a parent population exist for the same amount of time as their descendants? Yes, and we can see that in the diagram here. We never lost population A, the parental generation. We never lost the original parental population. They are there the entire time. That original species is there. But more and more and more species evolved from them, and they can still live all at the same time. They may even interact with each other at a later stage. But the key thing is, in order to be a new species, you cannot be able to reproduce with your original parental species. There are exceptions to that rule, and I am going to touch on them at a later stage. So the next piece of evidence for evolution is genetics. And genetics is a beautiful example of how science has very simply explained how we know for a fact that all organisms originated from one particular ancestral organism, and that's because genetics is shared amongst all living organisms. And we have a lot of similarities, but also differences in our biochemistry and our molecular structure. And these similarities and these differences provide us evidence for all the animals that share genes and express one or more of those characteristics. And these particular genes that I'm referring to are called regulatory genes. And what those are collections of genes that every single animal has that regulates the same functioning. And for example, something like muscle. There is regulatory genes that regulate the production of muscle in all animals in exactly the same way. In other words, you as a human grow muscle the same way a bird will grow muscle. The biochemistry, the map work is exactly the same. The regulatory genes are exactly the same. Now, how is it possible that a human can have the same regulatory genes as a bird? We are not the same species. We're not the same genus. How is it possible that we can share these genetics with one another if we didn't originate from a collective ancestor, a common ancestor? Another thing with genetics is all organisms have either DNA or RNA. And yet again, the beauty of that is the DNA is a huge collective map work or a recipe book of every possible gene outcome that you could have as a human, as a bird, as a rat, rodent. Any organism has DNA, and it's not just animals that have DNA or RNA, it's viruses, it's bacteria, it's protists, fungi, plants. They all have DNA or RNA, and that's another common feature that we share that can't be faked. And the more sequences that you have within your DNA that are shared between two species, the closer they are related, whereas obviously the less sequences you share, there is less of a relation. And that's often why we compare ourselves maybe to chimpanzees. We have 98% similar DNA to chimpanzees, and so we're very closely related to them. But even something like yeast, which is a type of fungi, you share at least 40% of your DNA with yeast. And so that 40% shows how many common ancestors we've actually shared with something as simple as a yeast molecule. Sorry, not a molecule, a yeast organism. And RNA and DNA are also written in the same language, the A, the T, the C, and the G, and the same nucleotides. And that's even further evidence that we have existed from the same ancestor, because we're written in the same language. I want to also very briefly touch on vestigial structures, and this is not really something that you need to know from the guideline, but I want to include it because it has been mentioned before in an exam. I think in the last 4 or 5 years it did come up, and I just want to mention really what it is. And a vestigial structure is a structure that exists in an organism that doesn't necessarily have a function, or it doesn't seem to have a function, and that's an important word, seem to have a function. An example of a vestigial structure might be in humans. For a very long time, we have thought that the appendix is a structure that has no function, but in actual fact, the appendix does have a function. Originally, we thought the appendix was there in order for humans to be able to digest bone. When our diets were we were eating more raw foods, we were eating bone, cartilage more often, but it's actually not 100% true. The appendix is actually responsible for the gut and immunity health of your large intestine. To pick up from that though, your structures, these vestigial structures, are sometimes reminders of structures where development had happened in an ancestral organism. I suppose a vestigial structure that may occur sometimes in some organisms could also be, there are at times snakes have a leg, very small, not functional leg, but they have a leg. And that's an example of a vestigial structure. And that's because reptiles evolved, and they would have evolved with legs first. And then over time, snakes would have evolved to not have legs, but they're still reptiles, of course, but they're just reptiles without legs. If you can think of any other human structures, perhaps, that are vestigial. So some examples of vestigial structures in humans are our tailbone and our wisdom teeth. So at the moment, our tailbone is greatly reduced. It's what you would imagine your coccyx bone to be. It doesn't have a function at the moment, but it's vestigial in that it is still there enough for us to know that it was something before. And some humans are actually born with, I want to call it a vestigial tail, where their coccyx bone actually protrudes through their skin, and it actually looks like a tail that you would see on maybe another ape, perhaps like a chimpanzee. It's also very rare though. Our wisdom teeth are vestigial structures. We still grow them today, and a lot of us have to have them removed because they give us a lot of problems with our jaws and being able to eat. But the wisdom teeth used to have a function. They used to allow us to crack bone, grind harder vegetative tissues and to eat raw foods, basically. We don't do that anymore. And we're certainly not eating very fibrous vegetation anymore. And so our wisdom teeth have become vestigial, and they don't really serve very much of a function. And so vestigial structures can be used as a form of proof for evolution, but I wouldn't like you to use them in your argument or in your answer for a test or an exam. I don't think that it's an accepted form of evidence for the final paper, but I wanted to mention it because it often comes up in this topic. The final thing I want to quickly touch on is embryology. It is not a form of evidence. For a short period of time, it was sort of accepted as an idea that could be used to explain common descent. And I mean, if you look at some of the embryos here of a fish, a turtle, a salamander, which is a type of amphibian, and humans, you can see why, if people look at these pictures, why they might come to the conclusion that we had common ancestors. I mean, we look so similar as embryos, and as we evolve, sorry, not as we evolve, excuse me, as we develop as an embryo, we seem to have some qualities that are similar to one another. But this has been proven not to be the case. So it's no longer a form of evidence. I wanted to mention it. Your textbook mentions it as it's a very short paragraph about it, but we no longer refer to embryology as a form of evidence for evolution. And so I want to wrap up this lesson saying one very important factor that I want you to remember when you answer a question about evidence surrounding evolution. If the question asks to provide types of evolution, evidence of evolution, you are going to list either fossil evidence, genetic evidence, biogeography. You are not going to give actual physical examples of types of fossil evidence and types of genetic evidence. In other words, you are going to say that the evidence for evolution is fossil, is genetic, and that's it. You aren't going to say DNA is an example of evidence for evolution, and intermediate forms of organisms are an example of evolution, evidence for evolution. When you write down the evidence for evolution, you are giving the types, you are not giving the examples. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. We'll pick up with our next topic in the next video.